Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Design Live Seminar, where we are thrilled today to have Alvy Ray Smith with us. And before I introduce Alvy, I wanted to remind you that we have 2 more talks this quarter. The week after Thanksgiving break, we're going to have Al Pisano and friends talking about their new makerspace ideas. And on December 10th, from the Mingay Museum, Richard Kendon is going to be talking about surfcraft, the history of surfboards. And so I have these. If you want to bring one of these back to your home department, you are more than welcome to take one. And today I'm excited to introduce Alvy because I get to repay a favor. He'll tell you a lot of the history of how he got interested in what he's done and some things that have happened along the way. And so I won't tell you a lot about his background. To give you a little preview, Alvy got his PhD from Stanford and spent the next decade at places that were real hotbeds of computer graphics, at NYU, at the New York Institute of Technology, at Xerox PARC, where he assembled a band of merry friends who together created a small company a few of you may know. It's called Pixar, a couple things. And I mean, the history of that story is just fascinating, as is how he got interested in computer graphics in the first place. As a former snowboard instructor turned computer scientist, I drew a lot of inspiration from Alvy's trajectory. But the favor that I get to repay today is that the first time I went to SIGGRAPH, the Computer Graphics Conference, the most exciting session was the session that Alvy was chairing. And so I walk in and I sit in this room in front of several hundred people. And Alvy graciously introduced and gave colorful backgrounds of all of the speakers. And as somebody who is just getting interested in a brand new field with brand new ideas, to realize that these weren't just 2-column papers on a page, but that the field was populated by people, and populated by people who are really kind. I mean, Alvy was a real shepherd and father figure to a lot of people in the computer graphics world. And so to see him have such passion and empathy for all the people involved, I saw that it was a field that was populated with good people, and so I thought it would be a good place for my career. And so let's welcome Alvy Ray Smith.
Thanks, Scott. That's very kind. Happy to be here in sunny Southern California. I've just spent a couple of hours with my longtime SIGGRAPH buddy, Tom DeFonte, and if you haven't seen his wave machine, I highly recommend it. It was a mind blower. Okay, so today's story is about how we got from the beginning to now. Okay, what I'm showing you on the screen right here is the first computer. And when I say computer, I mean stored program, general purpose computer. Okay, this is it. And believe it or not, its name is Baby. So Baby was the first computer. It was built in 1948 in Manchester, England. And when I went to visit Baby recently, well, a year or so ago now, this was on the screen. Baby's screen, the first computer's screen, had pixels on it, and where Pixar was scrolling. So the first computer had pixels and could animate in 1948. Who knew? I didn't know. So that's where we're starting. The first pixels, which are those, actually. Tom Kilburn, who built Baby, one of the people who built Baby, tested the memory. So the reason there were pixels on the first computer was it used a CRT to store bits. That was its main memory. So you're looking at the face of Baby's memory here, where a bit was a spot of 2 different sizes. So, of course, when you've got an array of spots, what do? You make a picture. So this is the first digital picture on the first computer. It actually dates from 1947 because they hadn't quite put the computer onto the memory yet. In fact, they could only write the bits, they couldn't read them yet. But that happened a couple of months later. And then I went looking further and I found the first video game, which happened at the same place, University of Manchester, on grandson of Baby. That doesn't make much sense, does it? But Baby's grandson, which is called the Franti Mark I, was programmed by Christopher Strachey, a good buddy of Turing's. By the way, Turing programmed Baby and wrote the programming manual for Baby and the Mark I. And then the second video game, oh, by the way, that's what's known as drafts in England, checkers here. The second video game I found on the EDSAC computer, which was like the second or third computer in the world, depending on who's claiming. Maurice Wilkes' machine at Cambridge, and this was programmed by Sandy Douglas. It's tic-tac-toe, or noughts and crosses, as they call it in Britain. So what I'm really talking about today, and the takeaway of all of this is, we've been writing a revolution for the last 50 years. You all know about it. It's Moore's Law. In fact, this is a picture of Moore's Law curve. And what I'd like to get across is, anytime we talk about what's happening in the digital world, we should bring this picture to mind to understand the dynamo that's driving it all. The reason there's been a 50-year revolution is because of this. So on the left, you'll see 1948, the first computer, and then there's kind of a 15, 20-year gap to 1965. The first computer was 10,000 times more powerful than a human being. By 1965, computers were 1,000,000 times more powerful than a human being. But Moore's Law began in 1965 at a factor of 1. That's the year that Gordon Moore got up and said, I think that transistors double, the density of transistors on an integrated circuit chip double every 18 months. And he predicted that that would last for 10 years. Well, it's lasted for 50 years. And the way, since people don't think in terms of density of transistors, I've put it into a more friendly terminology, and it means the same thing. Anything good, so this is Moore's Law in a more intuitive formulation. Anything good about computers gets better by a factor of 10 every 5 years. A factor of 10 is so large that we usually call it an order of magnitude, because an order of magnitude means not just bigger, but conceptually more. You have to reconceptualize after a factor of 10 to even know how to think about the new stage you have arrived at. So I'm trying to calibrate this revolution for you. We've now been through 10 orders of magnitude since Moore expressed his law in 1965. In 2015, which is just around the corner, we will have reached Moore's Law factor of 10 billion. And by the way, I've checked these numbers many times, and it's always dead on right. That's really how much more powerful computers are today than they were in 1965. And you'll see the path I'm going to take through this revolution, of course, is the one I know, the story of the group now known as Pixar. But you can see the points. We couldn't have gotten there until we got there. In other words, well, let me step back and say this. If you can see an order of magnitude or more up the Moore's Law curve, you can probably become a billionaire. It's really hard to do it, but every so often somebody does. They get ahead of the curve, and they're there first, and they're ready to pluck the fruits. The only example I have of that in my own career was that Ed Catmull and I, the co-founders of Pixar, started at New York Tech in the 70s, and we were able to see 20 years ahead that Moore's Law was going to deliver computers fast enough and cheap enough to do a movie. And we did see that little piece of the vision. But all this other stuff that happened, didn't have a clue. And by the way, Moore's Law is still in effect. And as we speak, 10 an order of magnitude every 5 years. And by 2025, it will reach 1 trillion. These are just silly numbers, right? We don't know how to think in terms of a trillion. Basically, you have to get there to figure out what it means. I can do some things like, oh, games will finally be anti-aliased. I can be pretty sure that that will happen, but that's easy. It's the things that we can't even conceive of now that will happen to be very interesting. What Tom does painfully now over in his lab will become trivial, I think, after 3 more orders of magnitude, so we hope. All right, so I'm going to start stepping along Moore's Law curve in 5-year increments, more or less. In the lower left corner, you see 10x. So this is Xerox PARC. The year range is over in the lower right corner, approximately. All right, so we jumped up from, by the way, I did my first computer graphic at Moore's Law 1. In New Mexico, I made a equiangular spiral on a computer for a Nimbus weather satellite antenna design. 10 years later, I had this great lucky break that my friend Dick Schaup built a paint program at this place called Xerox PARC, and I made sure I got myself hired on there because it was a chance for me to combine art and computers. I guess I should address something that Scott raised, how I got there. Was I was a professor at NYU, and I was skiing, and I broke my leg. Is this what you're referring to? Yeah. I broke my leg, and so I was in a full body cast for 3 months, nipples to ankle. Just, you find out who your friends are, serious body cast. And so for 3 months, I just thought about the world. That's all I could do. It actually was a fabulous experience. When you don't have to move your body, your mental space just explodes in size. So one of the things I realized was I was headed on this path, was doing cellular automata theory, and being promoted up the academic ladder. Maybe I shouldn't tell this story here. Anyhow, I came to the realization that I wasn't doing anything about my art. I had been a painter all my life, and I hadn't done anything about my art. I was just doing computer science. And I resolved, when I came out of the cast, I would resign from academia and go to California where something good would happen. And that's how loose it was. And I did just that. And the good thing that happened was my friend Dick Schaup was at this new place called Xerox PARC, where the personal computer, as we now know it, was being invented. I think everybody knows this story. And in particular, color graphics. Dick and I were doing color graphics, the first color graphics. So what you're looking at here are the first color pixels. Not exactly. There have been 2-bit colored pixels and 3-bit sporadic places along the path. But this is the first time there was an 8-bit pixel, 256 colors. This is his paint program. He was actually using 4 bits for the menu and 4 bits for the screen, for the canvas. So he only had a 16-color paint program, really. But I reprogrammed it into 256 colors. And I added this color transform at the top, HSB, which is still in existence, much to my amazement. All right. Oh, that's right. I've got some videos to show you, really crude videos that I'm just going to step through. I'm not going to make you suffer all through these, okay? This comes from Xerox PARC. And so forth, and so forth. It's pretty tedious. But nobody had ever seen colored graphics before. That was the first raster graphics used for art in the world with color. Okay, there was black and white around. All right, Xerox fired me. Actually, they never hired me. They issued a purchase order as if I were a piece of equipment. So I would come in and use Dick's machine and make art with it. But one day they canceled my purchase order, so I went in to talk to the supervisor. And, why? He said, well, we've decided not to do color. And I went, what? I said, the future's color, and you guys own it completely, because they did. They had the only color in the world. And the manager said, that may be true, but it's a corporate decision to go black and white. Yeah, hi. And so the next thing that happened was, we're going to leap another order of magnitude on Moore's Law, was New York Institute of Technology. My buddy David DeFrancisco and I, who had been making art together at Xerox PARC, jumped in my car and drove to Utah, and they wouldn't take us because we were too freaky looking. But they said there was a rich man who came through here and bought one of everything in sight. And he's got an animation studio on his campus on Long Island. So we said, oh, you mean we can talk art to this guy? They said, yeah. Did he buy a frame buffer? Now, a frame buffer is what we now know as a graphics card. But then it was a refrigerator-sized piece of equipment that could store 8-bit, basically 500 by 500 pixels at 8 bits, which is what you were looking at a minute ago. Dick had built the first one at Xerox PARC. We needed the second one to do this art we had in mind. And yes, Alexander Schur is his name, bought the next frame buffer that Evans and Sutherland was building. Boom, we got there as fast as we could and met the craziest man. Now the group now known as Pixar, which started here, has had 3 major patrons along the way that paid the bills. The first, you've heard of George Lucas and Steve Jobs, but hardly anybody knows about Alexander Schur. He was the first, the bravest, the craziest, and he lost everything. His own sons finally took his school away from him. His idea, he had an animation studio of the old-fashioned cell animation kind on the campus. By the way, this is the campus of New York Tech. It was 4 large estates all cobbled together, and the mansions on the estates were the buildings on the campus. So, in the upper left was where my girlfriend lived, the mansion she lived in. Tom Duff lived there, for those of you who know him. Lance Williams lived there, for those of you who know him. David DeFrancisco and Garland Stern and I lived on another estate nearby. Turned out to be David Rockefeller's wife's estate. And we stayed in the chauffeur's quarters, which was a 3-bedroom house above the garage. Okay. Lower right is the D. Seversky mansion. That was our video. That's where we did video on the New York Tech campus. It served as extras in several movies, like 3 Days of the Condor, Flight of the Condor, whatever the name of that movie is. And up there is another mansion called Gary House. And that's what it looks like up close. And that's what its garage looks like. Now that garage is where the group now known as Pixar started. Our joke is that, yeah, we got started in a garage. It just happened to be a 4-car garage. Ta-da-da. I walked in the door and there were 2 people there. Ed Catmull, who would be my partner for many, many years, and Malcolm Blanchard. So there were the 4 of us. David DeFrancisco and I from Xerox PARC, Malcolm Blanchard, and Ed Catmull from the University of Utah. And so we were the original 4 there, original 4 at Lucasfilm, original 4 at Pixar. Started all there. But the most important part about New York Tech was that there was this animation group there. Now, Uncle Alex, by the way, we called Alexander Schur Uncle Alex, because he turned out by sheer coincidence to be the uncle of my roommate at Xerox PARC in California. It's the sheerest of coincidences. So Uncle Alex was this crazy man who would say things like, our goal is to speed up time, eventually deleting it. Okay, what's that mean? You never knew what he meant. He was an entrepreneur. I mean, this was a money-making, it was a school, but it was meant to make money. It was really a diploma mill at the time. And he had us on the campus. We had nothing to do with the school. He had this cell animation group of about 100 people on the campus making a movie. This one, Tubby the Tuba. How many people have ever seen Tubby the Tuba? Really? It's not very good. It was done, so here was Uncle Alex's idea. His idea was the computers, he would bring these computers in, we would program them, and then he would fire all the people, and the computers would just generate the movies, and he would collect the money. And we said, no, Alex, it doesn't work like that. We can take care of the grunt work, but not the art. The important point is, this is where we learned our animation. We learned out from the old timers, people who had done Max Fleischer, Popeye cartoons and things like that. We learned the whole logistics of doing a major motion picture. And we had the idea, so this is the mid-70s. We had the idea then that we should be the first group in the world to make a completely computer-generated movie. So that's where our vision began, not realizing it was going to take 20 years to get there. And This place was a heaven. I don't know how to describe to you how much fun this place was. You saw it was a beautiful place. We got everything we asked for. We never had to worry about money. Uncle Alex would just get whatever we asked for and give it to us. So, for example, one day, he came in and said to me, we're the leading computer graphics place in the world, right? Yeah. What do we need to do to stay there? And I said, well, if you buy 2 more of these frame buffers, these 8-bit deep frame buffers, I can cobble them together to make an RGB frame buffer, and I explained to him that meant 24 bits instead of 256 colors, it's 16 million colors, and then things get serious and interesting. He walks away, I don't know whether he got that or not. Several weeks later, he comes back into the lab and he says, I bought you 5 more of those frame buffer things. So you'll have 2 of those RGB thingies. So we had the first RGB color in the world. And you're looking at some of the pictures right here. The bottom 6 are all mine. The upper ones are by various people at the lab. Ephraim Cohen, I don't know whether people know these people, but Ephraim Cohen did the bleeding hand. Lance Williams did the 2 on the right. Christy Barton did the height of art. And David DeFrancisco did the writhing snake-like things. Just try out. This happens to be the very first picture. So I wrote the first RGB paint program, and this was my test image. This turned out to be crucial in lawsuits for many years, where people in the 80s came along and claimed they had done it. And we said, no, you didn't. We did this in the 70s. Okay. And I started branching out like this. Most of these are 500 by 500 images, but I figured out how to piece frame buffer contents together to make higher res pictures. And here's some wonderful animation from that period. So Jim Blinn visited and he did that. And he did this, some texture mapping. Note the jaggies. The animation, remember there's an animation house here. They did a 1-frame animation movie and we added 15 seconds of credits. Oh, wait a minute, there was a little bit more to it than I remembered. Okay, there's the first animation out of our group. Here's Ed Catmull's first animation. There's Christy Barton's. And this is not my first, but it's something I did. Okay, bad stuff. Another interesting thing that happened at New York Tech was one of the most influential people in my personal life showed up, Ed Imsfeller, who was a great artist. He had started out in oils in the 30s. He had mastered 16 millimeter filmmaking art, video disc art. And the next thing he, of course, tackled was computer graphic art. He showed up one day at New York Tech. That's me with the black hair, by the way. Saying he wanted to make a 3-hour movie, and we burst out laughing. And he said, well, why are you laughing? We said, in 6 months, which was his time frame, you'd be lucky to turn out 3 minutes. But we did exactly that. We turned out a 3-minute piece called Sunstone. He and I did. And I'm going to show, I just recently got it, I saved it from videotape decay. The tape actually deteriorated as the bits were being pulled off it. But the guy who did the recovery did a marvelously good job. And I can show this to you. It's in the Museum of Modern Art. That's a lawn roller on a concrete driveway with a microphone down near it. Lance Williams did the tongue. So this is all hand-painted animation, right, frame by frame. first tentative steps into 3D, anti-aliased. I'm going to step on through. Anyhow, Ed was very influential in my life. The next thing he did after that was he came to Cal Arts and became the provost. And that's where he ended his life from cancer. One of the things he did as a 16mm filmmaker was go to the Nevada test site before everybody understood the danger of that. And he picked up skin cancer and it eventually got him. A wonderful man. I have children because of him. He told me it was a good idea. He says, it'll break your heart, but it's not to be missed, Alvy. So. All right, so this is leaping ahead another order of magnitude. This is New York Tech, 3210 Kerner, if anybody knows that number. And that's me holding the, well, let me do this. The camera shutter. The guy on my right is Ed Catmull, be my partner for many years. The guy on my left is this new kid I've just hired, John Lasseter. Now, Ed and I always thought it'd be Disney. Both of us were fans of Disney our whole lives. And we made secret trips to Disney every year for 10 years. The whole time we were at New York Tech, we made secret trips. The whole time we were at Lucasfilm, which is where this is, we made secret trips. And on one of these secret trips, we met this kid, John Lasseter. And he was the first animator who wasn't scared to death of us. A lot of animators thought we were going to take their jobs away, no matter what we said. But John got it. The thing is, George didn't, George Lucas. And he wouldn't ever let us do animation. So in order to hire John, we had to give him the title user interface designer. George didn't look very carefully at what we did, but he would have, if he had seen that, he would have axed it. So you'll recognize some of these other people. Lauren Carpenter is Mr. Fractal, and Bill Reeves, somebody mentioned Bill Reeves to me a few minutes ago, Mr. Particle System. And Rob Cook did Render Man, and David Salison now runs some biggie research division of Adobe. Sam Leffler wrote Berkeley Unix, so forth. Good group. And that's just some of this amazing group we put together. But we thought George Lucas had brought us out there because he wanted us to be in his movies. I mean, that's what we made it clear that we wanted. Yeah, we can build hardware and software, but we want to be in the movies. We want to make content. But after about a year, George had never come and talked to me about being in his movies. And finally, he doesn't get it. He thinks we're just tech people. So the lucky break that happened then was Paramount came to Industrial Light and Magic, the special effects branch of Lucasfilm, to get special effects done for Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. They brought me over and said, we want to do this shot. It was a rock in an aquarium that got mossy, something like that. And I said, do you guys understand what we can do with computers? And they went, no. I said, well, let me think about this overnight, and I'll come back tomorrow with a shot that we can actually do that'll satisfy your, the narrative requirements of the film. And they said, okay. So you can imagine, I walked out of that room about this high off the floor because I had just got the big break, right? I had just been asked to compose my own shot in a major motion picture. So I was up all night, needless to say, drawing storyboards. I used to show them, but they're so embarrassing that I don't show them anymore. I came in the next day and showed them the storyboards, and we landed the deal for this 60-second shot called the Genesis demo in Star Trek II. So I hauled the team together. So these are some shots out of Genesis demo. I put the team, I called the team together. I said, hey, we got the big break. Here's what it is. It's going to be this, It's going to be this video. By the way, I said, we can't do video yet to the producers. I mean, we can't do movie resolution yet. They said, that's okay, it's going to be a video shown to Admiral Kirk. I went, great, we can do video. So this is all done at video resolution, even though it was shown on the big screen. And by, I mean old-fashioned video, of course, 500 by 500, okay, not high def. I said, we're gonna satisfy our contract with Paramount, but what this really is a 60-second commercial to George Lucas, so that he'll know what the hell he's got here. And I knew this secret thing about George, and I still can't quite remember how I knew it, but I knew that when he watched movies, he was locked onto the camera. He knew every decision that the cameraman made. It didn't matter what the emotional content. Basically, if you can do that in a movie, the directors fail because you're not sucked into the emotion of the story. You're watching technical details. George could do it. But, so knowing that, I said, we're going to put a camera shot in here that's going to blow his socks off. It'll not be, CG 101, gratuitous 3D, whip your head around stuff. It'll make perfect narrative sense. But he'll know that no real camera could possibly have done it. So that was the plan. And that's what we did. So I'll show you a little bit of it here. I want to point out one thing in advance because you might not see it otherwise. Lauren Carpenter did Fractal Mountains for this shot. In the lower right there, Fractal Mountains. Fractals have randomness sort of built into the algorithm. So you don't quite know how high the mountains are going to be. And sure enough, our simulated spacecraft that was circling this planet crashed into the mountains in one frame. So Lauren went in by hand, found the data for that one frame, and carved a notch, by hand, put a notch into the mountain. So you'll probably see it now that I've set it up.
It is our intention to introduce the Genesis device into a pre-selected area of a lifeless space body, a moon or other dead form. The device is delivered, instantaneously causing what we call the Genesis effect. Matter is reorganized with life-generating results.
The jerkiness is not in the original, where that came from.
Instead of a dead moon, a living, breathing planet capable of sustaining whatever life forms we see fit to deposit on it.
Fascinating.
The reformed moon simulated here represents the merest fraction of the Genesis potential, should the Federation wish to fund these experiments to their logical conclusion. When we consider the cosmic problems of population and food supply, the usefulness of this process becomes clear.
See the big difference?
This concludes our proposal. Thank you for your attention.
You saw it, right? Okay. So that's kind of what, that was the big beginning, because the next day after the premiere, George just put one foot into my office. He's a pretty shy guy. And he said, great camera shot. And he was gone. So he got it. And he had us in his next movie for the first time, Return of the Jedi, just a simple shot. But more importantly, he told his buddy Steven Spielberg about us. And Steven put us also in his next movie. And then the word started to spread, that this might be a serious thing to consider. All right, so lots of things happened at Lucasfilm. I started assembling this great team of world-class computer graphics people. And in 1983, so this is shortly before I hired John Lasseter, at the 1983 SIGGRAPH, on the return from the 1983 SIGGRAPH, Ed and I decided that at the 1984 SIGGRAPH, so we decided this on the airplane returning. A year from now, we're going to show character animation for the first time at SIGGRAPH. We're going to put our peg in the ground and says, this is what we are about, this character animation. So I immediately, right then on this green engineering pad, drew another set of horrible storyboards that I also used to show, but I'm too embarrassed to anymore, of this, what would become Andre and Wally B. It was going to be a character named, an android named Andre would wake up in a beautiful environment, and he would stretch and yawn and welcome in the beautiful day of the future of computer graphics. It's a terrible story. But luckily, I hired John Lasseter about right then, and he looked at my storyboards. He says, "Alvy, do you mind if I make a couple of recommendations?" "Yes, please. That's why you're here." So he took my android character and he made this character. Still Andre, but he's cute. And he introduces a new character, a bumblebee, whose name had to be Wally B. Because, by the way, so we were calling this movie My Breakfast with Andre because we love this movie, My Dinner with Andre, okay, which co-stars Wallace Shawn. So when we added a co-star, it had to be Wally B. So the name became The Adventures of Andre and Wally B. And technically, what we did was we cracked the motion blur problem. We knew for years that we weren't going to make the big time unless we figured out how to do motion blur. I mean, it's easy to describe. It's, when the shutter of a film camera is open for a short amount of time, anything in motion blurs in the direction of motion. And we knew we had to do that or we'd get this horrible strobing effect that, if those of you know Ray Harryhausen's early Jason and the Argonauts stuff, his skeletons all do this stuttering thing across the screen that hurts to watch. It's bad sampling is what it is. So, before I started, just a little piece of it. George Lucas, this was shown at the Minneapolis SIGGRAPH in '84. George Lucas came to that SIGGRAPH. We went, finally, he's got it. We love animation, and we can do it. We can make content. Well, it turns out he hated this when he saw it, but he didn't tell us. In fact, I didn't know until a book was written several years ago that he had hated it. He could only see what he could see. He couldn't see that this was just early days and that we would, would become more graceful and higher resolution and all that good stuff just with the computer speeding up. He just saw what he saw. By the way, it wasn't even complete. We had some wireframes still in some of the frames, which he saw, and it just looked crude to him, right? All right. John Lasseter's first animation. Now I had to tone that down. John Lasseter had the stinger of that bee just being jammed right into the buttocks of the little boy, close up. And I went, John, that's so violent. So his accommodation was to have it happen off screen. But my 1-year-old son, Sam, whom I thought I was making this for, knew exactly what the story was. It's about this gigantic bumblebee stings the bejesus out of this little boy, about his size. He would hear the soundtrack and run screaming from the room. All right, the next important thing that happened at Lucasfilm was all these trips that Ed and I have been making to Disney started paying off. Even though the higher ups at Disney never, When we first started going to Disney, it was run by a football player who was married to Disney's daughter. That was his qualification. And he was just taking the company right into the ground. So he and his vice presidents they didn't have a clue what Ed and I were talking about. And so they blew us off year after year. But all the technical people did understand what we had to offer, and they were highly supportive of what we had to offer. But they just couldn't sell us to the management because the management were thunderheads. But those friendships paid off in the long run, paid off major. And one of the first place they paid off was, and this happened 1 month after Michael Eisner and Frank Wells took over the management of Disney. 1 month later, they knocked on our doors and said, you know that you guys always said you could digitize our cell animation process? We said, yeah, we'd already done it in New York Tech. We knew how to do it. Let's do it. So I wrote a 50-something page proposal and negotiated. They were tough negotiators. I negotiated this thing for 18 months. But we finally got a really great deal, and we did it. We built this system for them called CAPS, Computer Animation Production System. And from Rescuers Down Under on, all their two-dimensional movies were made this digital way. The only part that wasn't digital was the artwork, which is still done pencil on paper by the artist. You could argue that Rescuers Down Under was the first completely computer-generated movie, but I don't, because the art wasn't done on a computer. But the two companies loved each other because both companies overperformed on their part of the contract in every possible way. It's cheaper and faster and sooner and all the good stuff that hardly ever happens in the business world, but it did in this case. So there's a lot of admiration between the two companies fostered from this project. Another thing that happened was about this time was a Japanese company called Shogakukan, a very large printing company in Japan, came to me and asked us to make the first computer-generated movie for them. They would pay for the production, and it would feature this character Monkey, the Monkey King that people in Asia, kids in Asia, grow up with. There are thousands of stories about Monkey King. He's a god, but he's too young to handle his godlike properties, so he keeps screwing up all the time. And there are hundreds of tales about Monkey. I was a great fan of Monkey because the stories are collected in this giant set of books called Journey to the West. And here's a classic rendition of the Monkey King. And Lance Williams at New York Tech had turned me on to this guy way back in the 70s, to these stories way back in the 70s. And then I went to China in 1978, really early, before China had opened the borders. I was a member of a delegation that got invited to China, and I came back with stacks of Monkey books. It's the first time I'd found the complete works. I came back with 2 complete sets. So I was thrilled when this company came and said, hey, let's make Monkey the very first, we'll premiere computer animation using Monkey. Great idea. So we started working. We had story treatments being written, marketing surveys being done. John Lasseter started making character studies for Monkey. We had many, many meetings. Our mutual friend Lauren Hare was the go-between. It started getting serious. It became time where I needed to say, well, we need this much money to do it. And now remember, nobody had ever done a computer-generated movie before, so really we didn't have any notion. Had Moore's Law actually arrived? So I sat down and started running the numbers. And much to my disappointment, after I'd run the numbers as hard as I could, I realized it wasn't time yet. The computers still cost too much, the production would cost way too much, and it would take too long. To put numbers on it, it was going to cost $50 million, where $20 million was sort of the nut that somebody would bear in Hollywood at the time. And it would take 3 years, which is the worst part, just way too long. So I had to go to the company, Japanese company, and say, I'm sorry, but we have to back out. It doesn't make sense yet. what we need is 5 more years of Moore's Law. We need another order of magnitude. Okay. So what was happening right then, about the same time that this was falling apart, but I want it clear, we got a long ways into the development of this movie. It was just those numbers that finally said, Moore's Law is not here yet. Okay. About that time, George Lucas and his wife divorced. And as everybody in California knows, half the fortune goes with each spouse. In this case, I went to my buddy Ed Catmull and I said, you know, George never really understood who we were. He was just starting to get it, sort of. He just lost half his fortune. There are 40 people in my computer graphics group. He can't afford us anymore. He's going to fire us. Let's start a company. Now, this is two nerds talking to each other, right? Let's start a company to give these guys a home, because it'd be a sin. That's the word I used. It would be a sin. I grew up Southern Baptist, and he grew up Mormon, so I could use words like sin. It would be a sin to let this world-class team disperse. Ed agreed. We went across the street in Marin County and bought How to Start Company books. I bought 2, he bought 2. And then we did it. But it wasn't as easy as that sounds. You have to get, even though we had a good idea, we knew we had a good idea. We had to keep, eventually we had a good idea. As soon as Moore's Law did another crank. But, so Ed and I, you know, our first contemplation was, what's this company going to sell? We can't make movies yet. What do we do for 5 years to keep the group together? And we quickly said, well, it can't be software. That won't pay for 40 people. It has to be hardware. Well, we had built this machine for George Lucas called the Pixar image computer. And so we had a prototype. We were in Silicon Valley for all practical purposes. I said, we've got a prototype. Let's capitalize it and take it to market. So that was the idea for the company now known as Pixar. Holding everybody together until Moore's Law did this number, you know, this order of magnitude number, and we could make a movie economically. We shopped that idea to every venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. We went up and down Sand Hill Road, if you know about the fabled Sand Hill Road, and talked to every VC there was. Now, we were really lucky. Most people can't just walk into a VC and get an audience, but since we were Lucasfilm, we were kind of sexy, and they would listen to us. And Ed and I got a major experience talking P&L and cash flow and all that business stuff, and we had to go from 0 up to full speed really fast. So it was a great experience, but all of these guys said no, every single one of them. We didn't fit the profile of a startup company for a venture capitalist. So that took about a year. Then we decided we would find a strategic partner instead. The idea there is you find a large corporation and get them to partner with you. Strategic partnership, they own a piece, we own a piece, and we do something for them, and we keep our group together. Somehow this is supposed to work. We talked to at least 12, and I think 15 large corporations. And most importantly, we talked to General Motors. Now this was when H. Ross Perot, remember him, was part of General Motors. His company, EDS, had been folded into General Motors. And it was H. Ross Perot's branch of General Motors that got really serious about doing a deal with us to help, you know, our contribution to General Motors would be car design, beautifully rendered automobiles. Also, Philips of the Netherlands wanted to come in on the deal. So we got to the point, this deal got so far along that we were in the, you know, around a giant board table in one of the, you know, in the 40s in Manhattan somewhere in the Philips building with 20 people around the table. You know, there were 4 parties, half attorneys. Ed and I and our attorney representing the new company, Lucas and their attorneys, Philips and their attorneys, General Motors and their attorneys. It was one of the most horrific days of my life. I had the most I had a stress headache. Have you ever had it? They're killers. They are killers, actually. You don't want them. I had one. The future was being decided right here, you know. All day long, we'd log jam, and then some attorney would say, let's try this idea. And the log jam would release, and negotiations. Okay, at the end of that really terrible day, everybody shook hands and said yes. It was a done deal. In the business world, that's a done deal. The attorneys have to go write it up, get the signatures, but it's a done deal. But not this time. Because that very same day that I was suffering so, Perot was up at the General Motors building in 50s in Manhattan, telling the board of directors of General Motors they were a bunch of fools. And that news broke in the Wall Street Journal the next morning, and everybody knew without anybody saying anything that anything that had to do with General Motors and H. Ross Perot was dead, including our deal. Okay. Ed and I were frantic. Lucasfilm was frantic. They, basically they thought they were going to get nothing out of this. Just time to shut it down and fire us all. One of the people that had come through early in the game was Steve Jobs. He had met Alan Kay, who was a friend of mine from Xerox PARC, became his chief scientist, and he brought Steve up to Lucasfilm to see the best graphics in the world. And there was some interest expressed, but almost immediately Steve got thrown out of Apple. So nothing came of it. But he came to us, to Ed and me. He invited us down to his Woodside mansion while we were starting to look for money, and the word was kind of going out that we were looking for money. And he had us, I remember sitting on the grass at his mansion, and he said, what I'm thinking about doing next is buying you guys and running the company. And we went, no, we don't want that. We want to run the company, but we'll take your money. Which he agreed to, and he went into Lucasfilm and made his offer, and they laughed him out of their office because General Motors was already on the hook, we thought, for 3 times the amount that Steve had offered. Okay, but that had happened months earlier. The negotiations with General Motors happened. It fell through. Ed and we said, let's call Steve and tell him to make the same offer again. We think everybody is so frantic at this point that it'll work. And that's what happened. So that's how Steve became the financier of the spin-out company called Pixar. Now, he did not buy Pixar from Lucasfilm. You hear that all the time. It's just not true. He financed a startup, a spin-out corporation, of which he was majority shareholder because he put the money in. Specifically, if you read carefully, this is the deal, by the way. It's about yay thick with Lucasfilm and with Steve. The deal was that Steve would give the new corporation $5 million, which Ed and I just turned right, this has all happened too. We turned around and just co-signed that check right over to Lucasfilm to buy technology rights for all the technology that we had developed at Lucasfilm. So that's part of the capitalization. And then Steve put another $5 million in to capitalize the company. And he got majority ownership and a position on the board. So the board was Ed, me, and Steve Jobs. All right. So I'd like to say a couple words about Steve because I think he's way overblown in the history of Pixar. Maybe way overblown in general, but certainly about when it comes to Pixar. I thank him very much for the money. I've told you how many people did not give us the money. He did. So thank you, Steve. So he did that about right there. These are the points where Steve stepped in and directly helped Pixar. What I can't seem to get across to people is he didn't run Pixar. He was now running his own company called Next, an hour and a half away. And Ed and I quickly determined that the worst thing we could do is let Steve in the building. So our management style is keep this guy out of the building. We held all board meetings down at Next, which is the name of his Next company. And that worked. And then at the next time Steve stepped in, so the point is Steve was great when it came to money. He was also great when it came to business ideas. And he was scary in the negotiating room. If we wanted a real big deal, put Steve in the negotiating room. He just scared the pants off of whoever was on the other side of the table. So in particular, at that point, he stepped in and took the company public. It was a genius idea on his part to take the company public. We had no money, but we did have this property called Toy Story. It had just been completed. And even though Steve had nothing to do with it, when the critics in New York saw it and raved about it, he heard that. And he was a smart enough businessman to execute on the promise of that being a major movie. He took the company public, became a billionaire overnight. So it was, business-wise, he was spectacular. And then the purchase by Disney was another place you pull that scary negotiator into the room. All right. Oh, I could tell a lot of stories about him, but I won't. Okay. Anyhow, we made Toy Story. Disney, right at Moore's Law, right at the right place, on the Moore's Law curve. Disney shows at the door and goes, hey, let's make that movie you guys always wanted to make. We'll pay for it, you do it. Proceeds will be split such and such. There was one problem. So Ed and I were ecstatic. This is it, right? This is finally our dream is coming true. One problem was that John had been fired. John Lasseter had been fired by Disney. He never told us. We didn't realize he'd been fired when we snapped him up. It wouldn't have mattered one bit to us. But it mattered to him. He thought we would somehow think lesser of him. We didn't care. We had to get John to sign up to the notion of doing Toy Story with Disney. So one of the last things I did there, Steve and I had this horrible argument, and I wanted to get the guy out of my life. So it took me about a year to figure out how to do it. And during that year, I made sure that Toy Story was on the way. And the main thing was to have this meeting with Katzenberg, Jeffrey Katzenberg, who's a tyrant, kind of like Steve, awful lot like Steve. Articulate, tyrannical. Enough said. And John didn't want to work for this guy. So Katzenberg said, I know you think I'm a tyrant. He just took his head off. He said, I tried to hire you and you won't leave Pixar, so I'm going to make a deal with Pixar to get at you. You're the talent, which is all true. And at the end of the day, with a lot of talking, without the heavies in the room, the close of the day came, and I'm walking with John out to our rental car to fly back to Northern California. And I said to John, I said, what do you think? And John says, I can do it. So at that point, I knew it was going to happen. And that's when I felt free to start another company that I sold to Bill Gates. My joke is I sold the first company to Steve Jobs and the second one to Bill Gates. And guess who one of my investors was in my second company? Steve Jobs. So like I said, he would have come through on the money. I could proceed with other things here, but I think what I would rather do, since everybody knows the Pixar movies, is open it up for questions. Anybody have any burning questions? I love to answer questions.
Yeah, what did you do at Microsoft?
Say what?
What did you do at Microsoft?
I was the graphics fellow at Microsoft, the first graphics fellow, and I came up with a vision for their imaging. I thought, gee, they have all these separate imaging products. Why don't they have one kind of overarching view? It seemed perfectly logical to me, but I wrote all that up and it kind of went nowhere. What I actually did was they took my product from my second company called Altamira and brought it to market 5 times. In other words, different versions. And despite what you've heard of Microsoft, from inside, they're an awesome company. First of all, they don't mess around when it comes to programming. First of all, they spent a year speccing the product, paper and pencil speccing. Then they turned their programmers loose. At the same time, they turned their testers loose against the myth. And get out of the way. Once that train rolls, it's ferocious. And they set a deadline and they make it. They did this 5 years in a row, a new product every year, and I got to watch it. It's amazing. I hate to compete against them. Awesome. But basically, they shut it down after 5 years. So I'm sad because I use that product all the time. It's so much better than Photoshop. But yes.
So when you started this, let's say in your late 20s or mid 20s, you had a vision of where it might eventually go.
Yeah, not really. We just knew that you could make a movie out there, as soon as Moore's Law gets there. What that would be? Would it be a special effects movie? Would it be art? Would it be animation? We kind of quickly figured out that, a movie was going to be the way that pictures with enough money behind it to be interesting were going to happen, because Hollywood's famous for gambling big. We thought it'd be animation because we knew about animation after being at New York Tech. We learned from the old masters, what the logistics were. And it pretty quickly fixed on that. But what would the content of the animation be? Well,
Oh, not content, but the tech. How close are we today to fulfilling what you had imagined?
oh, we're way beyond that. I mean, Moore's Law says you can't. The order of magnitude says I can't predict what would be there. I can tell you what I'm looking for now myself. Pixar is not, by the way. I don't speak for Pixar anymore. Are human beings. To me, the next holy grail is the cameraless movie, the live-action movie, full of human beings, even an emotional close-up that has no humans in it. The humans are driving the actors, however. They're just not on the screen. All the humans on the screen are avatars. We're getting close. We're getting really close. I think that's another Moore's Law thing. We will have the horsepower to do it. Fact is, let me step forward to. There's a guy named Mark Sager in New Zealand. I'm going to New Zealand here in a few days to see him. Has a baby, Francesca, and he started modeling her as realistically as he could, much better than you see in this cheap shot here. And she has gotten older, and he keeps changing his model as his daughter gets older. Now, he's a master. He's one of the masters in the world of making human avatars look convincingly real. But he's doing one more thing. I keep insisting there's always an actor behind these. In this case, he's put an artificial intelligence behind this baby, which he calls Baby X. It's very primitive. It's a long ways shy of what a real baby intelligence is like, which is awesome, by the way, if you haven't been around it. But there's somebody coming at actually doing the thinking engine behind an avatar. But I think that's so far away that I'm unwilling to predict that it'll even be possible. But I want to end on that slide because I started with a baby and I wanted to end with a baby.
Where do you see three-dimensional, immersive, off-the-screen graphics?
Now, do you mean stereo stuff, or you're actually immersed in a room full of stuff?
Let's just say virtual reality kind of.
Well, I pointed out Tom. You've got the center of the universe right here with Tom DeFonte. So go see his cave and his wave if you want to see where that is. It's getting, today, I'll just tell you what I saw. I was in the temple at Luxor, Egypt today, and it was so good. I mean, we were roaming around in it in 3D. It was so, and it's wrapped around me, so I was immersed in it. And it was so good that I turned to Tom and said, I'd like to actually go there, but I don't feel like I really have to because I've now seen it kind of the way I would have seen it there. It's very impressive. You should see it.
I guess my question is more from the narrative, because narrative is written by people who are controlling the storyline.
Yeah.
And then you're in a space, and you're that unknown quantity.
I have no idea how that's going to unfold. That's one of those, to me, let's get there and see what happens. The technology is still nascent. It's been predicted for, since Jaron Lanier way back 20 years ago, but it's just not been that impressive yet, but it's starting to get there. What will storytellers do with it? Can you use it in a public forum somehow? All these are up for grabs ideas. Another idea is the, what's it called? What? Oculus Rift, where you superimpose three-dimensional graphics in special glasses on the real world that you're involved. there's a lot of ways this can go, and I think it's going to be hard to write narratives to it, but, you know, I'm an old man now. Maybe I just can't see anymore. Yes.
I was wondering, in the case of human-like avatars, like, what are your views on the uncanny valley problem?
I don't think it exists. There was this notion for a while that we humans are we're so specific about representations of human beings that if they basically aren't a human, we will be repulsed by almost humans. And it was called the uncanny valley, that you couldn't cross. You could get close, but you couldn't cross this uncanny valley. It's not there. The proof was that it's already happened. Curious Case of Benjamin Button. How many people have seen this movie? Did you know there's a Brad Pitt in there that's not Brad Pitt? There are several shots of Brad Pitt that are complete avatars of Brad Pitt. And I went in knowing this, and I couldn't spot it. And to me, that's a Turing test, in a sense. It was really hard to do, so we haven't seen much of it, but that's one of the things I think is going to come, is that people are starting to understand how to make... Now, Brad Pitt, back to my point, Brad Pitt, the actor, was still driving that avatar, because we haven't a clue how to do acting, or intelligence, or consciousness, or any of those really interesting things that, you know, there basically is a religion amongst my peers about that. Many of them believe it's possible, but they can't tell you how, so they have to take a leap of faith.
What did you learn from Ed, and what did Ed learn from you?
Oh, Ed and I we got along so well. And it's curious because I was this freaky hippie from, you know, the Summer of Love and all that in San Francisco, and he was this really strict Mormon missionary. But he had done his missionary work at Coney Island, oddly enough. But he had had trouble with the Mormon church at Vietnam time. He wanted to be a conscientious objector, and the church wouldn't allow it. And so he started questioning his church. And it kind of, I wouldn't say it liberalized him, but it did enough that he would let freaky type guys like me in without questioning what we did, and let us be around him. And the reason it worked so well with Ed is he never was a boss. We were a very collegiate outfit. There were only bosses when you had to have somebody make a decision, but it was basically just as flat as you could make it. And everybody counted, and everybody spoke. There was no hierarchy of any sort. So, which is why I didn't get along with Steve Jobs, because he insisted on master-slave, right? And we just did not work that way. So he was very bright. I think he brought really good technology to bear, and I brought artistic stuff to bear, which he didn't have. And we just kind of meshed in a really nice way. I'm a talker, and he wasn't. He is now. He's learned quite a bit. Now you see him on the stage, and I was kind of looking at him and saying, that's the guy I started with? You know, he couldn't hardly stutter out anything. He's mastered it. And we just did everything together for 16 years. There was no reporting or any of that kind of, we just did everything together. Because it was small, it was easy to do it that way.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just really curious because you just look at reality in a very special way as well to model how things move into software. Is there one example of something where you've done that, where the reality actually turned out to be much different than you actually saw?
Well, I'm not sure this answers your question, but Finding Nemo, the movie Finding Nemo that Pixar made. Now, I was gone by the time it was made, but I live right there, so I'm surrounded by all ex-Pixarians, and my son worked there to do some of the research. They researched underwater really carefully, coral reefs and these dazzling fish and all that stuff, and they put it on the screen, and it was so dazzling. Reality was so dazzling that it dominated the foreground characters. So they had to go back in and turn all the reality knobs down, so you'd be watching the characters instead of the setting. I don't know if that answers what you said at all or not. But. Yes, sir.
How did you develop the storytelling arc for what you do and the iterations of storytelling on Pixar? Because it's phenomenal what you've done with that.
Well, that's really, I didn't do that. That's John Lasseter. John, and he's brought in these great animators like Pete Docter and Andrew Stanton and so forth. They just took the old story techniques of Disney They cover the walls with storyboards, and they act out the parts. And when part of a story doesn't work, they tear down the storyboard and put another one up there, and they just keep changing and changing it the old-fashioned way until they've got a story that works, and the jokes that work, and the emotions that work, and then they work with the technical people to turn it into animation. It's just, I think it's classic storytelling. It's nothing computery about it at all. My favorite animator, by the way, is not John, even though I hired him. It's Brad Bird, favorite animator at Pixar. Brad came by early in the game while we were still... Ed and I shared an office with Marcia Lucas, George's wife, at first. There was no place for us, so we just shared an office over an antique store with Marcia. And so this is early. It's just Ed and me. There's nobody else there yet at Lucasfilm. Brad Bird shows up and wants to work with us. Ferociously wanted to work with us. He pled. And he's the funniest guy on the earth, by the way. He and I would walk around and he would just have me in stitches, everything he said. It's just so funny, just a naturally funny human being. But he was also completely non-technical. He didn't have a technical bone in his body. And I knew that anybody that dealt with us at that early stage had to put up with pain. It was the nature of the beast. Computers were slow, air conditioners were loud and cold, and it was painful. But we knew Moore's Law was out there cranking away. It would all go away. But we knew that Brad couldn't adapt to that. So I was tickled pink years later when he made The Incredibles at Pixar, because he still didn't have a technical bone in his body. But the software, which has been written and interfaced to in deep interaction with the animators, has now become so easy to use by people of Brad Bird's ilk that he could make a movie. So those are two of my favorite Pixar movies, by the way, Incredibles and Ratatouille, that he did. He has a little more bite to his humor than the others. Anybody else?
What made you decide to leave Pixar and start your own thing?
Oh, okay, it's Steve Jobs. I guess I should tell the Steve Jobs story. Everybody likes to hear Steve Jobs stories. My summary, by the way, of Steve Jobs, he's a tyrant, a bully, and a liar, just to kind of put it in perspective. But I thank him very much for the money and the other things I told you about. Okay. For one thing, he stole my credit from me for co-founder. I'm the co-founder of Pixar, but if you read the company officials, he's the co-founder. No, he wasn't. Wasn't anywhere close. And, okay, so we always had a tough relationship because I told you I don't put up with hierarchy. And he insists on it. So at board meetings, he would show up, and one of his tricks was he's a very charismatic man, as you've probably heard. One of his tricks is he'll say something so outrageous that he grabs the room in the first utterance. I wished I could tell you, I'd be Steve Jobs if I could tell you one of his outrageous statements, but it's just a jaw dropper. And he's got you. Unless, so we make these, I'm getting my stories mixed up here, but I would be the guy that when Steve would say something outrageous, I'd say, oh, Steve, come on, that's not true, that's not how it works. I'd give the, come on, that's not the way it works. So over the years, this worked. For many years, it worked that he would say something outrageous and then he'd look at me as if I was going to react. It wasn't comfortable, but it worked, I got to say, look, that's BS without saying so, and state the facts as I actually perceive them. But one day, at a board meeting at Next, he attacked me as a street bully, not an intellectual attack. This was a street bully. He came down on me. I was sitting down and he was standing up. He came down on me, insulted my Texas accent, ridiculed me, and now that I look back at it, it's clear what I was supposed to do is go belly up to him. But I was raised in Texas and we don't do that, right? So I went up in his face. And we were screaming at each other, full bull rage, about that far apart. I still can't believe this happened, because that's never happened before or since. And in the middle of that rage, I brushed past him and wrote on the whiteboard. And Steve says, you can't do that. And I said, what, write on the whiteboard? Now, what I had done was I had broken an unwritten rule that only Steve gets to use the whiteboard. 'Cause it's part of his theater. He gets up and he works the whiteboard into his presentation. So he owns the whiteboard, but it never got said, and I hate unwritten rules, and so I broke it because he had broken a personal thing with me. He stormed out of the room, and I was in shock. I had no idea I'd never been treated that way. And I knew I was in trouble when our VP of sales reached across. He's from Texas also. He reached across, and he took my hand in one of those two-handed handshakes, and he said, only a guy from Texas could have done that. But I knew it wasn't a compliment. He was saying, like, you poor sucker. But the fact is, Steve couldn't do anything about it. He was chairman of the board, but he didn't run the company. Ed and I ran the company. Ed would have had to fire me. Ed wasn't about to fire me. But I didn't want that guy in my life anymore. I saw his true colors. I didn't want him. I didn't want to be anywhere near that guy anymore. And so over the year, after that, got Toy Story into play as I've described to you. Got John to agree to Disney, work with Disney. I had this idea for a product, and I spun out a company to do that product. So that's the story. And Steve owned 10% because I developed it at Pixar. So just to close another circle I don't usually close is the big investor was a guy who was H. Ross Perot's right-hand man, who knew me from that negotiation with General Motors that had fallen apart. So he heard I was starting a second company, and he said, I want to invest in your company. So it's funny how these things, these relationships you make, even in stress, sometimes work out in the business world. Yeah. Okay, I think I'll stop there.